South African Speaker Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula is required to hand herself over for arrest on Friday following a graft investigation. Reports of Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula's imminent arrest follow an early morning raid by law enforcement authorities on her Johannesburg home on 19th March. The move is part of an investigation into claims that she had solicited a cash bribe of around 2.3 million rands via mobile phone text messages from a former military contractor during her time as Minister of Defense between 2012 and 2021. From Cape Town, South Africa, I have Sanusha Naidu, Senior Research Fellow at Institute for Global Dialogue. Thank you so much for joining me today.
And thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Now, investigators raided the Speaker's home on Tuesday as part of the corruption inquiry, but did not provide further details on the investigation or the corruption allegations, although there are reports on what this could be about. Tell us, what are the details of the corruption allegations leveled against the Speaker?
Well, I think it's part of the ongoing investigation that's happening in terms of what was reported in a media report about 2 or 3 weeks ago about the Speaker of the National Assembly being implicated, allegedly, for now, because we still have to go through the investigation and for the investigation to find its evidence. But there is a company that's led by a former colleague, colleague of, I wouldn't say of the Speaker, but linked to a company that is linked to somebody who worked in the SANDF at the time, and claims that she had been at various points asked to provide bribes in different types of code words used, totaling to the value of about $2.2 million, a million rand. And this in itself is the subject of the inquiry. So I think the company and the whistleblower has been given some kind of deal with the SIU and the Hawks. And of course, as you rightly point out, in the insert, charges have been dropped, but I don't think they've dropped completely. There's some kind of agreement in place with the whistleblower, and in terms of what she's claiming in the context of the fact that the Speaker has demanded bribes. So the raid on the Speaker's home in the past couple of days was really, I think, around this issue in terms of trying to piece together whatever evidence they could get. And of course, what has happened this morning is that the Speaker has not been arrested, and that needs to be emphasized. And there's a lot of hype in the media, both here and outside of the country, suggesting or intimating that the Speaker has presented herself to be arrested. No, she has not. I think these things need to be clarified, because this is where misinterpretation and misinformation becomes the kind of trajectory of what's going forward. She has actually issued a countervailing application to demand the kinds of things that she's demanding for in terms of the raid on her house and what they were looking for, and to go one step further and demand that she needs to, these things need to be verified in the context of her being implicated in this whole issue around the bribery. And then the second issue is there was a spike in the media as well to suggest today that the Speaker was going on a trip to Switzerland, but now we hear that she's on special leave, that she would not be in Parliament. And Parliament is going to rise in the next 2 to 3 weeks, because we go into an election in May, and Parliament only has about 2 or 3 weeks left. If you take away next week and the following week, then Parliament will actually have to be dissolved. And so for the new Parliament to be constituted, this Parliament has to be dissolved. So in effect, the Speaker just has about 2 weeks as effectively as the Speaker of the National Assembly. And so there are questions being raised. I mean, this morning we also heard that the opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, has issued its own court application to demand that the Speaker be held accountable, to demand that some kind of legal framework is taken forward.
Right.
Again, in terms of where she is and what she's doing, and should she be reprimanded in the context of the parliamentary ethics?
All right, thank you so much. Okay, I mean, you just answered like 3 questions, so I didn't even bother stopping you since you were already answering some of the questions I had in mind. But now let's look at the severity of this case, the possible ramifications, and how this must have affected the Defense Department of the country while she was in charge, if these things actually turn out to be true. I'm just looking at, what that could have been.
Well, I think it does create a severe reputational risk and damage to the optics of the defense and our defense ministry. It also creates a lot of questions, I think, now with this allegation being ventilated in the public domain, and of course with the raid, as the Hawks have made that raid on the Speaker's house. It raises questions if we have to go back and start now reviewing all of the contracts, the transactions, the procurement processes that took place within the ministry under her leadership as Minister of Defense. And I think, that in itself becomes another arduous and onerous task on the state, because it also dampens the question around the state capacity to root out these kinds of transactional issues that happen in terms of procurement and how procurement should be much more accountable. The second point, I think, is it circles back to the Zondo Commission and the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into State Capture, and the recommendations that were made by Chief Justice Zondo at the time, where it was argued that something much more proactive, something much more engaging and much more emphatic needs to happen to address state capture, or to address the gray box or the black box of procurement in the country. So I think all of this kind of ties back and circles back to each other in not a good way. And I think this is now becoming quite a serious blight for the country in terms of the investor confidence, in terms of the business. Is this how you really do business in the country? And of course, the real challenge is trust of institutions, and not just institutions of the state, but I think across the board as well, in how people feel and what is their reaction to this whole situation.
I like what you just said last, and I'm also looking at, the grey list, FATF grey list and all of that. I'm looking at what perception are we giving and all of that. But then don't you think this also casts a shadow on her role, even as Speaker?
Well, she came into that position in a very controversial way as well. So I don't think it can be it can be a deeper shadow than what she currently has hanging over her. I mean, she came into that role after the July 2021 riots. Remember, she was the Minister of Defense at the time. There was questions around what her department and ministry were doing, what kind of engagements and intelligence, and were they aware, and what kind of interventions were happening. She and the president were not on the same page. They were basically at odds with each other in terms of how to define it, whether it was a riot, whether it was an insurrection, whether it was a civil uprising. There were all of these things. She and the president really didn't come to a kind of agreement of how to approach this thing and what the interventions would be. And it was quite surprising, I think, that somebody needed to be held responsible. Should it have been the Minister of Police? Should it have been the Minister of Defense and Military and Veteran Affairs? Or should it have been the Minister of State Security? And I think we saw the fallout there. And the Minister at the time of State Security, and who should have been, or if I get it correctly, I don't know if it was Minister of State Security, but I know it was Ayanda Dodlo, who eventually took the rap for this, and then was given given the kind of repercussions that she had to take. And then eventually she took a position out in the World Bank as a director. And yet the minister at the time, who's now the current speaker, got the position of Speaker of the National Assembly. So I'm not saying that this is not something we should take lightly or tread lightly on in terms of the shadows that follow her, but she hasn't been without shadows, is what I'm saying. It seems to follow her a lot. And now this is the latest kind of crisis that will also tarnish her as an individual and in terms of her own reputational risk.
Doesn't this come, at a bad time for Ramaphosa? I mean, he's vowed to clean up corruption in government, and the governing ANC, when he became president in February 2018, isn't this a further statement as to yet another failure in his anti-graft crusade?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends as well. When you're looking at the anti-corruption crusade and you look at what level of corruption takes place, and I suspect it's in Nigeria as well, right? You can go for the easy wins, which has been happening, and I don't want to be completely dismissive of where corruption has actually been addressed, where people that are involved in corruption have been actually brought to account. They have been the letter of the law. The judicial process has taken place. But I think, if you're thinking about the bigger levels of corruption, the deeper levels of corruption, whether it's South Africa, whether it's Nigeria, we got to accept that these things take time. And to answer your question, I could flip it around and ask you, how successful has it been in your country as well, in terms of the failure, in terms of dealing with the bigger levels of corruption, and who are the masterminds behind this corruption? We've had whistleblowers who have been very brave in this country to have shown the light in the dark spaces where procurement, corruption, and other levels of poor transactional issues have taken place without following regulatory frameworks. And those people have, essentially bore the brunt of being about openness, about transparency, and about whistleblowing. So we're seeing legislation, and we're seeing a shift in that way to protect some of the interests, not enough though. And of course, in the same way that if it hurts too close to the political architecture of the country, then we do know what happens in the context of corruption. So I'm not saying, I don't want to trivialize it to a point of casting and pointing fingers across the bow and saying whose corruption is more endemic and who's not. But I think the point is that.
All right, I guess you're trying to talk about some of those things. I mean, it's corruption we're talking about here, and it's something that has to be dealt with. If you can hear me, I'd like you to go ahead. Maybe if you could just wrap up in 5 seconds, so we just take our last topic or last conversation.
Yeah, so I just want to finish off the point on corruption. I think, it's always going to be a blight on anyone's country, whether it's yours, whether it's mine, whether it's China, whether it's India, whether it's the EU, the US, any country. So I think that's a challenge. And that's going to be something that's going to be part of this election process going forward in terms of the campaigning and so forth. And I think that at the end of the day, however we root out corruption and however we eradicate corruption will always come with some pain.
All right, I guess we're pressed for time now, and we just have to wrap up here. It's been a pleasure having you, Sanusi Naidu, Senior Research Fellow, Institute for Global Dialogue.
Thank you.
All right, this is our episode, or that's it on this edition of Business Edge. Follow us on social media. We are at New Century TV. You can also go to our website, www.newcentral.africa. You can download our mobile app on Play Store and App Store. Till next time, I am Perpetua Fasami Peter. Bye for now.